Hi, happy to be here with you today to present the report called Pathways to Net Zero, a decision support tool, which the Transition Accelerator released in January of this year. So to start off, why did we prepare this report? Essentially, what we wanted to do was evaluate pathway options for Canada getting to net zero, and try and produce something that was reasonably concrete and accessible as a tool for decision makers who are trying to decide, policy and investment and so on related to net zero GHG emissions. The basic kind of message that I would say behind this report is that it's time for Canada to stop muddling on and doing a little bit of everything, and instead try and focus on the strategic priorities in order to get us towards net zero. So starting off then, what do we mean by net zero? Essentially, what we're talking about is balancing any residual emissions with removals. So the definition is really straightforward, and we're using it here for the country as a whole. In other words, when we reach the net zero target, any residual emissions are balanced by removals. So I guess the thing really, from our point of view, that's really important is that shifting the climate discussion towards net zero really changes everything in the sense that it becomes absolutely clear that solving the climate problem is not about incremental emissions reductions. It's about getting rid of GHG emission reductions, GHG emissions, and no net addition of GHGs to the atmosphere. And in practice, actually, net zero really means working to get as close as possible to actual zero emissions. And the reason for that is that many of the negative emissions approaches that we talk about are highly uncertain. For many of them, it's not clear just how well they will work, whether we can do them at scale, what they will cost, and how permanent is the sequestration of GHGs. So because of this uncertainty, the focus now really should be on squeezing each sector right across the economy as close to actual zero as we can. And as we move forward over the next decade or two, we can see more clearly which sectors are actually getting stuck and which of the emissions removal technologies might actually work and prove feasible. So what makes this report different? I mean, firstly, I should stress this is not a modeling report. It doesn't do new modeling work, though, of course, it does draw on conclusions of previous work. But really, it's trying to emphasize that we also need qualitative assessments of the pertinence, the advantages, the disadvantages of different approaches towards emission reduction. And so it's primarily based on a deep dive into the literature and consultation with experts. And there are two main lenses that we bring to bear on the issue. The first is what we describe as a transition lens, and the second is energy system analysis. So what do we mean by a transition lens? So this is essentially drawing on experience of historical socio-technical transitions. So this is the way that societies have made big socio-technical leaps. For instance, the building out of the electricity grid, the shift from horse-drawn transport to automobile transport, sailing ships to steamships, and so on. So we draw some lessons from that literature. And here are kind of four really important points that the transition lens helps us to understand. First, that getting to net zero requires a fundamental adjustment or transition in multiple systems of social provisioning. So it's not one transition, but many. So we're in the habit of speaking about the energy transition or the net zero transition, and that's fine. But actually, that means a whole series of transitions in the major systems of social provisioning. So how our cities are organized, how we get around, move people and goods, how we provide for electric power or agriculture, and so on. And what's important to realize is that each of these systems has distinct dynamics. There are different obstacles and enabling factors for change. So the focus when we think about moving to net zero really should be on sectors and regions, and not just kind of treat the economy as one big blob. So another important thing is that transitions go through phases. So typically, there's a long time when there's perception that we could do things differently or better, or we need to solve problems, but the solutions are not quite clear. They're not ready to for general application. Then you reach a period of rapid growth or build-up, acceleration, and finally the transition is carried through an adjustment with other areas of society and so on. So policy should be oriented appropriately, taking account of where we are in different sectors and regions and so on. And finally, that these transitions in these large systems, like how we move people, or the built environment, are not just about climate, because all these systems have other problems, disruptive currents, transformative forces that are changing them independent of the climate question. So just think about the move towards digitalization and in relation to automobiles, the move towards self-driving, autonomous vehicles and so on. Many, many changes are happening as well. So what we need to think about is how climate changes related to climate or net zero are integrated in the overall transformation of the system. In other words, don't focus on changing, making net zero what we have now, but making net zero, making improved systems that are also net zero for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and so on from now. The energy system lens, which was the other one we bring to bear, really looks at how energy is transformed, used, produced throughout society. And the kind of two big questions are, what does our energy system look like today? And what would a net zero energy system look like in the future? So this is just a kind of simplified diagram of Canada's current energy system. I'm not going to go through it all, but a few things that you can see that really stand out. So firstly, fossil fuels still provide about 3/4 of our final energy consumption. Most of Canada's fossil fuels are exported, 60%. You can see that electricity provides 20% of final consumption, with other things like biomass, the residual. The little clouds in this diagram show you the GHGs that come in various places in this process. So more than 1/4 come from fossil fuel extraction and processing, another 1/4 from transport, and then kind of 10, 12%, something like that, for buildings, industrial, agri-food, and so on. And this diagram also shows you how our electricity mix, what provides generation capacity today, and also some of the ways in which the different energy supply feeds into end use. And I should note that in agriculture, most of the emissions, about 80%, are not energy related, but are process emissions related to manure and use of fertilizer and so on. But the basic thing you can see here is our continuing high dependence on fossil fuels. So thinking about a net zero energy system, we've kind of tried to catch it kind of schematically here. So one of the things you see is electricity is much bigger. The fossil fuel sector has withered. Hydrogen or some other net zero emission fuel is being used in places that are hard to electrify. There are no percentages of here, of course, because we don't know how this will play out exactly. And some things are really clear, like the central importance of electricity. What's less clear is the relative size of the components. So will electricity have it almost all and hydrogen just a little bit? Will hydrogen be more important? How big will the fossil fuel, residual fossil fuel, which has to be meet net zero requirements. So it's got CCS and some kind of offset or negative emissions. How big will that sector be? How centralized will the electricity system be as opposed to decentralized? Those are lots of issues that we don't know the answers to yet, though models suggest that some things are more likely than other things, but they'll actually get worked out in practice over the next decade and beyond, depending on political decisions, the relative economics of different solutions, and so on. And up here on the right-hand side of the slide, it just lists some of these key decarbonization tasks, which you're probably all familiar with. The need to squeeze out any fossil fuel generation from electricity, develop and deploy net zero fuels, enhance energy efficiency, so we need to produce less energy, address non-energy emissions, and so on. So in this report, we explore pathways to net zero, and we have quite a broad definition of pathways, that it's the sequence of changes of technology, infrastructure, business models, societal practices, regulatory change, and how those things are ordered over time in order to get to net zero. And the great advantages of pathways is that they allow us to map the scale and direction of change and look at some of the problems on the way. They can help us avoid dead-end pathways. So this is basically things that look good now because they give some rapid emission reductions at low cost, but really can't get us towards where we need to go for net zero. So a good example of this is blending ethanol, first generation biofuels into gasoline. We do that in Canada. It kind of gives some not too expensive short-term emission reductions, but we can't be running our transport system on corn-based ethanol and other first-generation biofuels in the future. So it isn't a pathway that leads us to net zero. So as far as we're concerned, it's a waste of investment and effort and time. In the report, we provide an examination of 8 different sectors or subsystems. In each one, we look at a snapshot of where it is today, what the obstacles are, what some of the other problems in the sector or system are, and then a detailed assessment of specific pathway elements that can accelerate or contribute to systemic change. And this is just a page where we look at kind of summarize the situation for light duty vehicles, looking at their role, the current emissions, systemic problems, the stage of the transition, and so on, options for decarbonization, and so on. And we do this for each of the sectors that we cover. And then we apply these evaluation criteria to look at detailed pathway elements. We look at how mature the technology is, its economic potential, social acceptability. Can it do the job that's proposed for it? Can it really contribute to net zero, and so on and so on. With respect to the net zero potential, we emphasize 3 things: that whether it can be part of a net zero future. So obviously an internal combustion engine car can't be part of that future. Is it a necessary step to get to net zero? So is it like a transitional step that will develop technology that's immature today? Or is it a change accelerant? Can it do things politically, economically that allows other change to gather pace? And at the end of these various criteria, we give a kind of overall assessment that's presented in a table like this. And so over the top, you have our various criteria, and down the left-hand side, different technological or social options for getting to net zero. So I'm not going to go through all these boxes, obviously, but just to give an idea, a battery electric vehicle is pretty green across the whole way. And in the end, we conclude it has economic development opportunities, as well as multiple benefits, including the climate benefits. So it's a high priority approach that's potentially part of a net zero world. And just to take a contrast, ethanol blended with gasoline does not score so well on our uh, tableau here, because the blends are not ultimately compatible with net zero, and it isn't really a transitional fuel that opens a way to a pathway to net zero. So it's not a priority for investment. We do that kind of analysis for each of these main sectors, these 8 sectors that we look at. And these are just kind of postage stamp snapshots that we have of our basic conclusions. So for example, power is almost 10% of Canadian emissions. There are multiple low carbon options that are already mature. It's in the diffusion phase of transition. And what we need to do is just accelerate the phase out of fossil usage as fast as possible. Another advanced one is the electrification of light duty vehicles. And this contrasts with some of the industrial sectors or agriculture, where we have some ideas how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but models and plans for the whole sector, how to transition the whole sector, are much less mature. So this just kind of puts them on a classic S curve, where you see power cars are relatively advanced, buildings are pretty good. We know a lot of how to retrofit, but other things like agri-food and some heavy industry sectors are further back down the curve. And the importance here is that policy should be adjusted to where the things are on the curve. In things that we know how to do, we should really, excuse the pun, step on the gas in order to deploy them at scale, where there's other things we need a lot more experimentation to firm up the alternatives. So the critical messages of this report are: it's time for Canada to stop muddling along and trying to do a little bit of everything and please everybody. We need to think about this in terms of the system transition to net zero, not just short or medium term reductions. And I mean, the criteria for policy should not just be, does it give us some quick, cheap emissions reductions, but it should be, does this advance the overall journey to net zero? We should focus on places where we can accelerate system change now. So that's particularly electrification of transport, fully decarbonize electricity, and get to work on retrofitting buildings. We need to drive down fossil fuel production emissions, so things like methane controls and others. And then develop options for the less mature sectors, like agriculture, really heavy transport, industrial sectors, and so on. So going forward, we plan to continue to expand and deepen this analysis with more sectors, policy profiles, scorecards, and so on. We know the analysis is imperfect. There may have been areas we've got it wrong, and so we encourage your feedback and suggestions to tell us where we can do better. And I would encourage you to go and look at the full report, which can be found at the Transition Accelerator website. So thank you very much.